In Washington, a lot of people have lost sight of the escalating crisis in Syria and our involvement there. But listen to Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell.
It looks like we are at war in Syria, but this would be a war that would be without the authorization of Congress. And it's time that Congress votes on what is the timeline, what is the troop commitment, and what is the terrain that is covered.
Excellent questions. Here to discuss, CNN military analyst Major General James Spider Marks and Colonel Cedric Layton. Also with us, CNN counterterrorism analyst Philip Mudd. Gentlemen, it's so good to have you on. General Marks, I'm going to start with you. Do you agree? Are we getting closer and closer to open conflict with Syria?
Well, Don, good evening. I think what we see in Syria has evolved over the course of time, where we have the United States with coalition partners going after ISIS. What has happened is that has now crossed over in terms of these virtual lines between the war of the opposition against the Assad regime. And so you have kind of a dog's breakfast in Syria, and it's very, without being flippant, it's very difficult to separate those two. So, no, the United States is not in any hurry to go against the Assad regime right now. We are supporting in a particular way, but our primary emphasis is to continue to reduce the caliphate that ISIS has created in Syria.
Colonel Layton, as you say, the president's lack of a coherent Syria strategy is incredibly dangerous. Explain that.
Well, Don, it's dangerous because if you don't know where you're going to end up, it's really hard to even start on that journey. And so I think what we're looking at is, it's clear to me that the president wants to destroy ISIS. On the other hand, he's also doing some things that go against the Assad regime. And, I know we want to do a lot of different things in Syria, or at least that's some of the messaging that we get, but there's no coherent plan to take care of ISIS and then do Assad or the reverse. None of that has been articulated. None of that has been articulated publicly. And it is certainly clear that if we got involved in something like this, it would be a very difficult thing for us to do and very difficult to extricate ourselves from it.
Philip Mudd, a lot has happened this week, and I want to read what's happening. Russia fighter jet flew erratically within 5 feet of a U.S. aircraft. The U.S. downed 2 Iranian-built drones over Syria. The U.S. military shot down a Syrian jet, and just a couple of hours ago, a NATO F-16 fighter jet tried to approach the plane of a Russian minister and was driven off in the Baltic Sea. Do you share Congressman Swalwell's concerns?
I think we need to be more careful about what he's talking about. This game is getting, in some ways, simpler, Don, and nobody wants to speak the truth. That is, the Assad regime has gained ground. The opposition that we support has little prospect of gaining ground. By gaining ground, I mean of taking power in Syria. Iranian-backed forces have gained ground. Here's the bottom line. If we want to stay engaged in Syria, if we want to stay engaged in an operation that potentially has lethal consequences in terms of shooting down aircraft, we've got to face a tough reality. Assad is winning. If you want to beat ISIS, you either accept the fact that a bloody dictator will win and go talk to the Russians and say, what do we do about Assad's victory? Or you continue a civil war where the U.S.-backed forces are destined to lose. It's a difficult conversation that nobody in America wants to have.
I find it interesting, General Marks, that you say that President Trump could actually spark a war. How?
I think the challenge that we have right now is playing on what Phil indicated, is that even the Obama administration, now the Trump administration, must acknowledge, and in many cases did acknowledge, the Obama administration did acknowledge, that keeping Assad in place was okay, because we understood that Putin's relationship with Assad was not going to be broken. However, I would suggest that Putin would shoot Assad in the face tomorrow if he understood that ultimately Russia would not lose its presence in the Mideast, its presence in Tartus, and the regime after Assad would be in some way favorable to Russian interests, and the United States would have to acknowledge that we're okay with Russian presence in the Mideast. Look, the Russians were in the Mideast in a permanent way long before we were. So that's been accepted over the course of years. That outcome, I think, is acceptable, and we need to embrace it, as Phil indicated.
Yeah, much more to discuss, so stay with me, gentlemen.